His lawyer leaned in and whispered 5 words, just 5. And Vincent's face, that smug, self-satisfied face I had stared at across the breakfast table for 15 years, went completely white. His hands started trembling so violently that the papers he had been so eager to sign were shaking like leaves in a storm. And me, for the first time in 3 long, exhausting years, I smiled. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning because you need to understand how we got to this courtroom and how a woman everyone thought had lost her mind actually played the longest, most patient game of her life. My name is Alexis Dunst. I am 34 years old, and until 3 months ago, I was married to Vincent Mercer. 15 years of marriage is longer than most Hollywood relationships, and definitely longer than my patience should have lasted. But I am a stubborn woman who inherited her grit from a grandmother who never took nonsense from anyone. I met Vincent when I was only 17. I had graduated high school early, not because I was some child genius, but because I was practical, motivated, and desperate to get out of my parents' house. I landed a job at a law firm as a file clerk, earning minimum wage and maximum paper cuts, but it was mine. By 18, I had worked my way up to legal assistant because I was good with details, good with numbers, and even better at keeping my mouth shut while keeping my eyes wide open. Vincent was 24 when we met at a client event, a man full of charm and dreams about building a massive real estate empire. He talked about the future like it was already his, like success was just waiting for him to show up and claim it. He said he was going to build something incredible, and I, being young and in love, said I would help him file the paperwork. We got married when I was 19, and our son Tyler came along when I was 20. I kept working at the law firm part-time while raising our son, building up my retirement account, and saving every spare dollar I could find. My grandmother always said a woman should have her own money, not secret money, she would clarify, just her own, something nobody could ever take away. At 23, Vincent's business finally exploded. He asked me to quit the law firm and help him full-time because he needed someone to manage the books, handle clients, and coordinate contractors, someone he could trust with his life. So I became his unpaid everything: bookkeeper, office manager, client liaison, and interior decorator. I did it all while raising Tyler and keeping our household running perfectly. My official title was wife, but my unofficial title was everything else. For 11 years, I poured my soul into building Vincent's dream, and for 11 years, he got all the credit and the awards. At every industry event, I was just Vincent's wife. He thanked his team and his mentors, but somehow he never quite got around to thanking me. Somewhere along the way, the man I loved shifted. He started making major decisions without consulting me and staying late for work more often. He began criticizing the little things, like the way I dressed or the meals I cooked. And he even had the nerve to mock my lack of ambition. I was running his entire back office for free while raising his child, but according to him, I wasn't ambitious enough. Then, 3 months ago, he dropped the bomb. He came home on a Tuesday evening while I was making his favorite dinner and sat me down at the kitchen table with a cold, businesslike look on his face. I want a divorce, he said. And then he added that he wanted the house, the cars, the business, everything. He told me I could keep Tyler as if he were a piece of leftover furniture he was graciously allowing me to take. I just stared at him as 15 years of marriage ended right there between the salt shaker and the butter dish. Within a week of that cold announcement at the kitchen table, Vincent had completely occupied our life, and I found myself relegated to the guest room in the very house I had helped pay for. My once expansive walk-in closet was reduced to 2 small sections he graciously allowed me to keep. A silent message that I was now a stranger in my own home. Within 2 weeks, he stopped hiding the reason for his sudden change in heart and started bringing her around. Brittany Sawyer was 27 years old and worked at his company. Of course, she had that Instagram perfect look with expensive highlights and yoga pants that cost more than my weekly groceries. She walked into my kitchen like she owned the title deed, wearing my grandmother's vintage apron while making smoothies in my blender. She was younger than my marriage and younger than my favorite designer handbag. But Vincent paraded her around like a trophy he had earned for his hard work. They would sit on my sofa, watch my television, and eat off my plates while Vincent put his arm around her right in front of me, treating me as if I had already become invisible. The humiliation escalated daily as he began stripping away my resources. First, he canceled my personal credit card, claiming we needed to separate finances for the legal process. Then the joint card followed. Eventually, he suggested with a straight face that I should probably find somewhere else to stay while we sorted things out. His mother, Lorraine Mercer, arrived to help me pack, which really meant she went through my belongings like a vulture, deciding what I deserved to take and what was a marital asset. She packed my life into black garbage bags instead of boxes, treating me like trash being cleared out of the way. She even hesitated on my grandmother's recipe box, as if she were considering claiming that too. Through all of this, I thought I had one sanctuary, my best friend, Diane Holloway. We had been friends for 20 years, through babies and breakups and everything in between. She was the first person I called, and she was so supportive, bringing over wine and letting me cry on her shoulder. She told me I deserved better and that Vincent was making the mistake of a lifetime. But soon, things started feeling off. Vincent seemed to know my private thoughts and my apartment hunting plans before I even finalized them. If I told Diane I was thinking of fighting for a specific asset, Tyler would come home the next day saying his dad told him that wouldn't work. Then it clicked. I remembered the way Diane always lit up when Vincent entered a room and how she complimented him just a little too much. My best friend was his spy. She had been carrying a torch for my husband for 15 years, and Vincent, who collected admirers like stamps, knew exactly how to use her. He made her feel important, giving her just enough flirting and hoped to keep her loyal to him instead of me. 20 years of friendship were sold out for empty promises. But the worst part wasn't the cheating husband or the traitorous friend. It was watching my son, Tyler. He saw the girlfriend, the grandmother packing my bags, and the way his father treated me like I was nothing. Vincent was constantly dripping poison in his ear, telling him I was the one being difficult and dragging out the process. Watching my son look at me with confusion and doubt was the knife that actually drew blood. I hired Nina Castellano, a lawyer sharp as a razor, who initially looked at me with pity, thinking I was a woman too broken to stand up for herself. She had no idea that I was simply waiting for the right moment to reveal the 3 years of secrets I had been holding in my binders. I sat in my tiny kitchen at 3 a.m, surrounded by 3 years' worth of printouts, and did the math one final time. What I had found 3 years ago on a random Tuesday night had changed everything. While Vincent was out working late, I had been reconciling the company books and discovered a strange transfer to an account I didn't recognize. I dug deeper, following a trail of breadcrumbs that made my blood run cold. Vincent wasn't building an empire. He was building a house of cards that was already on fire. Our beautiful home, the one everyone envied, had 3 separate mortgages on it, totaling over $1.1 million, even though the actual market value was barely $850,000. We were underwater by $250,000 on our primary residence alone. The business was even more of a disaster, drowning in nearly $500,000 of debt, maxed out credit lines, and unpaid back taxes. Even the luxury cars we drove were just leased with massive balloon payments looming on the horizon. My husband had spent $1.9 million of borrowed money on cryptocurrency losses, gambling, and a secret apartment for a woman I hadn't even met yet. We looked rich the same way a mannequin looks alive, convincing from a distance, but completely hollow up close. My first instinct back then was to scream, but I knew Vincent would just manipulate me or try to seize my separate inheritance. So I chose the long game. I worked with my retired accountant uncle to move my grandmother's $520 into an untouchable trust for Tyler, and then I waited for the day Vincent would try to discard me. When I finally presented these binders to my lawyer, Nina, she sat in stunned silence for an hour. The pity in her eyes was replaced by pure awe. She realized that by letting Vincent _quote_0_ and take every asset he demanded, I was actually handing him every cent of that $1.9 million debt. He was so blinded by his own arrogance and his desire to impress Brittany that he wasn't even looking at the balance sheets. Nina told me she owed me an apology. She had thought I was a lost kitten, but she realized I was a chess grandmaster. We began the final phase of the plan, the performance of a lifetime. I had to make sure Vincent felt so superior that he would never suspect a trap. The next 3 months were a masterclass in acting. I showed up to every mediation session looking defeated. With red eyes and trembling hands, I spoke in a soft, broken voice, telling the mediator that I just wanted enough to start over and that I didn't want to fight for the business, because it was Vincent's life's work. I requested a measly $50,000 and my personal belongings, relinquishing all claims to the property and the company. Vincent sat across from me with a look of smug pity, convinced he had broken me. He was so eager to finalize his victory that he didn't realize that every time I gave up an asset, I was actually handing him a ticking financial time bomb that was set to explode the moment the judge signed the final decree. Vincent agreed to my modest settlement terms almost before the words were out of my mouth. He was so incredibly relieved that I wasn't fighting for half of the quote two he had spent years bragging about that he practically glowed with triumph. He looked at me with a condescending smile, the kind you give to someone who has completely surrendered, and I let him. I deserved a Golden Globe for that performance. I played the role of the discarded, broken wife to perfection, all while knowing that every signature he was about to make was pulling a noose tighter around his own neck. His arrogance became his greatest weakness. He stopped being even remotely careful, convinced that he had already won and that I was too weak to ever pose a threat again. To celebrate his upcoming quote _3 _, Vincent went out and bought himself a new $15,000 watch, using the business account, a charge I saw hit the books immediately. He wore it to our next mediation session, making sure the light caught it every time he moved his wrist, a silent taunt to the woman he thought he was leaving with nothing. He even took Brittany to La Maison, the incredibly expensive French restaurant where we had celebrated our 10th anniversary, and posted photos with the caption that life is good when you're finally with the right person. He didn't realize that the right person in his mind was actually a woman who had already started redecorating my house, painting over my carefully chosen sage green kitchen with a cheap builder-grade gray that matched her personality perfectly. While Vincent was busy playing the successful bachelor, our son Tyler was starting to notice the cracks in the facade. He was only 15, but he was observant. He saw the designer bags Brittany carried and his father's new watch. Yet he heard Vincent complain that we couldn't afford the school trip to Washington, D.C. He saw the disconnect between the glittering life his father was projecting on social media and the reality of the bills piling up on the counter. One evening, Tyler came to my tiny apartment and asked me if his dad was actually rich or if he was just pretending. I reached across the table, squeezed his hand, and told him to just trust me and wait a little longer. My teenager had figured out the truth before a single lawyer in that courtroom had even considered it. Behind the scenes, Nina was polishing the trap with surgical precision. The main divorce agreement stated clearly that I was relinquishing all claims to the house, the business, and the cars. But attached to that agreement was an addendum, a detailed liability disclosure statement that listed every single mortgage, every maxed-out line of credit, and every lease obligation. By signing for the assets, Vincent was legally and irrevocably assuming all the debt tied to them. 2 weeks before the final hearing, his lawyer, Harold, actually grew suspicious and requested a full financial audit. But Vincent, pressured by Brittany to quote _4 so they could start their new life, shut it down instantly. He signed a legal waiver declining the audit against his own lawyer's advice. He was so impatient to be rid of me that he literally signed away his right to know he was bankrupt. The night before the final hearing, Vincent sent me a text message thanking me for not making things ugly. I stared at that message for a long time, marveling at the audacity of a man who had thrown away 15 years of marriage and was now thanking me for making his exit easy. I simply replied that I wanted what was best for Tyler. On Thursday morning, April 17th, I walked into courtroom 4B feeling a strange mix of nerves and cold, hard clarity. Vincent arrived wearing his charcoal Armani suit, looking every bit the successful mogul he pretended to be. His new $15,000 watch glinted under the fluorescent lights as he shook hands with his lawyer, Harold. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and triumph, while his mother, Lorraine, sat in the gallery dressed for a celebration, having already decided that I was the loser in this story. I took my seat beside Nina, dressed in a simple navy dress and looking exactly like the broken, defeated woman I had spent months pretending to be. Judge Patricia Holden, a woman with 30 years of experience who had seen every trick in the book, took the bench and reviewed the file. She noted that the parties had reached a voluntary agreement where Vincent would assume all marital assets, including the residence and the company, while I would receive a modest $50,000 settlement. The judge turned to me, her eyes searching for any sign of coercion. She asked if I understood that I was giving up substantial property, and if I was sure this was what I wanted. I kept my voice soft and slightly unsteady as I told her I just wanted my husband to have everything he asked for, and for the process to be finished. The judge sighed, likely frustrated to see a woman seemingly walk away from her life's work with so little, but she allowed the signing to proceed. Vincent grabbed the pen with an eagerness that was almost embarrassing. He signed page after page, barely glancing at the text, his mind already on the celebratory lunch he had planned with Brittany, who was waiting in the hallway. I signed slowly, my hand steady despite the performance, savoring the finality of each stroke. Across the room, Vincent glanced at his mother and winked. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he didn't notice Harold, his own lawyer, finally reaching the last document in the pile, the liability disclosure addendum. As Vincent sat back, basking in his victory, I watched Harold's face undergo a terrifying transformation. He started flipping back through the pages, his eyes widening behind his glasses as he processed the numbers. He leaned in and whispered those 5 words to Vincent. "You are assuming all debt." Vincent tried to wave him off, telling him not now, but Harold's voice turned urgent, pointing at the mortgages and the business liens. For the first time, Vincent actually looked at the paper. I watched the color drain from his face as he realized that the house he fought for was underwater by hundreds of thousands, and the business was a hollow shell of debt. He hadn't just won the empire, he had personally signed for every cent of the $1.9 million collapse. Vincent stood up so abruptly that his chair screeched against the courtroom floor like a dying animal, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. "This isn't right," he shouted, his voice cracking as the smug confidence he'd worn for months evaporated in an instant. He looked at me, then at the judge, then back at the papers in his trembling hands, his face contorting with a mixture of rage and sheer panic. "She hid this from me," he bellowed, pointing a shaking finger in my direction. "This is fraud. She manipulated the numbers." Judge Holden's voice cut through his outburst like a frozen blade, commanding Mr. Mercer to sit down immediately. But Vincent was past the point of reason. He kept insisting that the numbers were fake, and that I had tricked him into signing his own death warrant. "Mr. Mercer," the judge's tone left no room for further argument. "Sit down, or I will hold you in contempt." He slumped back into his chair, his breathing heavy, his hands still shaking so much that he had to grip the edge of the table. Judge Holden adjusted her glasses and looked at the documents with a cold, analytical eye. She noted that the liability disclosure statement was not hidden. It was clearly attached to the agreement he had just signed, listing debts tied directly to the assets he had fought so hard to claim. She asked him point blank if he was telling the court that he, the CEO and owner, didn't know the financial status of his own business or the mortgage status of his own home. It was a devastating question that left Vincent stuttering, unable to find a lie big enough to cover the truth. Harold, sensing the ship was sinking, stepped in to protect his own professional reputation. "Your Honor," he said, clearing his throat awkwardly, "I must note for the record that I strongly advise my client to conduct an independent financial audit before today. I have a signed waiver here where Mr. Mercer explicitly declined that review against my counsel." The judge reviewed the waiver and then fixed Vincent with a hard, unforgiving stare. She told him that he had been given every opportunity to investigate the assets he was claiming, but he had chosen to sign his rights away because he was in a hurry. "You assumed this risk voluntarily," she said, her voice echoing the finality of the situation. "The court does not protect people from their own lack of due diligence." Vincent turned to me, his face a mask of desperation, and whispered, "You knew? You knew about all of this?" I met his eyes calmly, no longer needing to play the role of the broken victim. "I was your bookkeeper for 11 years, Vincent," I said quietly. "I knew where every single penny went, even the ones you thought I'd never find." The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had spent 3 years digging a hole, and I had simply stepped back and let him finish it. Judge Holden brought her gavel down with a resounding crack. declaring the marriage dissolved and the agreement final. I stood up, smoothed my dress, and walked past my ex-husband, who was now staring at a pile of debt that would take him a lifetime to pay off. I walked out of that courtroom and into the marble hallway, my heels clicking with a steady, confident rhythm that felt like a victory march. Behind me, the heavy wooden doors couldn't muffle the sound of Vincent's voice rising to a panicked scream as he turned his fury on Harold, demanding to know how a lawyer he paid $500 an hour could let him sign his life away. But the most satisfying moment was yet to come. Brittany was leaning against the far wall, scrolling through her phone and probably picking out new furniture for my house. But as soon as she saw Vincent's face through the glass and heard the word bankruptcy echoing out, her expression shifted from boredom to pure, cold calculation. She didn't even wait for him to reach the door. She grabbed her designer bag, turned on her heel, and moved toward the exit so fast she was practically a blur. By the time Vincent stumbled out into the hallway, looking for comfort or someone to blame, Brittany was already gone, her exit as fast and clinical as her entrance into my marriage had been. I watched from the elevator as Vincent stood there alone, his Armani suit suddenly looking like a costume that didn't fit him anymore. The collapse that followed was like a row of dominoes falling in slow motion. Within 2 weeks, the house I had spent 15 years turning into a home was stripped bare. Brittany had moved out in the middle of the night, taking anything that wasn't bolted down and leaving behind a note that simply said this wasn't what she signed up for. The gray kitchen she had been so proud of sat empty, a monument to a life built on nothing but pretension and borrowed money. Within a month, the bank's phone calls replaced the social invitations. Vincent tried to list the house for sale, but when the realtors saw the 3 mortgages and the total debt, they laughed him out of their offices. He was underwater by $300,000, and there was no magic trick to make that disappear. The business I had helped build for 11 years began to disintegrate as vendors filed lawsuits, and the lines of credit were snapped shut like a trap. The man who had once bragged about his vision was now reduced to hiding from process servers and avoiding his own mother's phone calls. Lorraine's Christmas newsletter that year was suspiciously silent about her son's achievements, focusing instead on her own bridge club, because she couldn't admit her perfect son was a financial failure. Even my former friend Diane tried to crawl back into my good graces, sending me long, rambling texts about how she had been, quote, 5, and how she'd always been on my side. I didn't even give her the satisfaction of a read receipt. I simply blocked her number and moved on. Some bridges are meant to be burned to keep you warm while you walk away from the wreckage. But the true closure came from Tyler. He watched the whole facade crumble. He saw the trophy girlfriend flee at the first sign of trouble, and he saw his mother standing tall. One evening, as we sat in my new, smaller apartment, he told me that he finally understood why I had been so quiet for those 3 years. He realized that I wasn't being weak. I was being a protector, ensuring that while his father chased ghosts, his own future was locked away in a trust fund he could never touch. The $50,000 settlement I had requested was just enough to get us established in a modest 2-bedroom apartment, a place that felt more like a home in 1 week than the mansion had felt in years. I spent my first few days painting the kitchen a soft, hopeful shade of sage green, the color Vincent's girlfriend had been so quick to cover up. The trust fund, that $500,000 shield I had built from my grandmother's legacy and my own years of saving, remained untouched and growing. It was a silent promise to Tyler that his world would never collapse again, no matter how many houses of cards his father chose to build. I finally enrolled in the interior design certification I had dreamed of at 23, realizing that my life hadn't been wasted. It had been a long, difficult apprenticeship in the art of survival. About 3 months after the final gavel, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find a man who looked like a hollowed-out version of the husband I once knew. Vincent had lost weight, but not in a way that looked healthy. His skin was sallow, his eyes were bloodshot, and his charcoal suit was wrinkled and stained. The $15,000 watch was conspicuously missing from his wrist, likely sold to pay a lawyer or a debt collector. He stood in the hallway of my modest building, looking at my simple furniture and my sage green walls with a look of desperate longing. He told me the bank had taken the house, the business was in receivership, and even his mother wouldn't loan him another dime. He actually had the nerve to ask if we could talk. if maybe I could help him look at the books one last time to find a way out of the mess. I leaned against the doorframe and looked at him, and for the first time in 18 years, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, not even the sting of betrayal. I realized that the man standing before me wasn't a mogul or a villain. He was just a small, selfish person who had finally run out of other people's lives to burn. I reminded him of that Tuesday night at the kitchen table when he told me he wanted everything except our son. I told him he should be happy because he got exactly what he asked for. He got the business, he got the house, and he got the everything he thought was so valuable. Then I quietly closed the door on his excuses, locking it with a click that felt like the final period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. I walked back into my living room where Tyler was finishing his homework, the light from my new desk lamp casting a warm glow over the room. My first real design client, a woman who had also survived a late life storm, had sent me a thank you note that sat on my counter. I looked at my grandmother's photo on the shelf and realized that I had followed her advice to the letter. I had kept my own money, I had known my worth, and I had refused to let a small man make me feel small. The apartment was quiet and the space was humble, but every inch of it was paid for by my own hands and protected by my own wit. I was no longer the assistant to someone else's dream. I was the architect of my own peace, and for the first time in my life, I was truly, beautifully free.